The oldest remaining lighthouse in the Great Lakes and the second oldest in Canada has a haunted history. It is located on the western side of the Toronto Islands at Hamlin's Point. The lighthouse was built in 1808. In those days, the Toronto harbor did not look the way it does now. The land was already a crime scene when the first lighthouse keeper was murdered. A crime on stolen land. Gibraltar Point was named by the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, John Graves Simcoe. He named the spot after the territory south of Spain, honoring Roman and Greek times when Gibraltar was considered the edge of the world. The distance between Fort York and the lighthouse did not seem as far as it does today. What we call the Toronto Islands are an archipelago. Soldiers from Fort York would visit the lighthouse for liquor made by the first lighthouse keeper, John Paul Radelmuller. Originally from Bavaria, he worked as a porter for Prince Edward, the brother of King George III, and became the lighthouse keeper in Toronto, which was called York in that year, which was 1809. John Paul was the lighthouse keeper during the War of 1812 and the Battle of York on April 27, 1813, when the Americans attacked Fort York. It would have been wild for him to see and hear the explosion when the British lit hundreds of barrels of gunpowder off before they escaped to Kingston. The explosion was heard like miles away, and there was metal pieces found like 2 kilometers away or something. I don't know. Soon after, the Americans looted the entire city, going into people's houses or pillaging. The Americans retreated to Niagara. Like, there was really nothing here. It was all exploded. It was an explosion site. A month before the war ended, John Paul Radelmuller was acquainted with British soldiers stationed at Fort York. They knew him as a friendly Bavarian man who had a small cottage next to the lighthouse. On a cold night, January 2nd, 1815, 2 soldiers of the Glengarry Light Infantry, John Blueman and John Henry, visited the lighthouse. It is possible John Paul had a still and produced his own liquor when he wasn't tending to his lighthouse duties. Perhaps the soldiers arrived drunk, but the common legend is that the 2 soldier Johns became belligerent over alcohol. That's surprising. It could have been because J.P. Radelmuller sold them liquor that froze during a cold trek. When this happened, the soldiers would have known John Paul had watered down the alcohol. For anyone who loves to drink, they would understand how infuriated the soldiers would have been about this. Or perhaps when the soldiers visited John Paul and the alcohol ran out, they became angry and wanted to fight the lighthouse keeper, thinking he had more to supply them with. Other versions of the legend was that he overcharged the soldiers or tried to cut them off from drinking anymore. The commonality of the story is that the soldiers became enraged and murdered John Paul Radelmuller. The story goes on that the 2 drunken soldiers chased John Paul up the lighthouse stairs, and either he died when he fell to his death, or another story is the soldiers beat him with belts and sticks until he was dead. This theory was told by the 4th lighthouse keeper, George Durnan. George's family said he dug up a jawbone and piece of coffin in the apple orchard beyond the meadow where cows roamed outside the lighthouse. He reburied the bones, believed to be John Paul Radelmuller. Most of the evidence collected points to John Paul's body being found examined by the coroner, and buried next to the lighthouse. Eamon O'Keefe dug into the history and tells us that the drunken soldiers dismembered JP's corpse and buried the body parts around the lighthouse. Some of the haunted stories about the lighthouse are hearing a moan as you walk down the small lighthouse stairs and whispers that sound like a man saying. Some report seeing a shadowy figure at the top of the lighthouse, unexplained lights, blood stains on the staircase, or that JP's ghost haunts the 13th step of the lighthouse stairs. The final lighthouse keeper, Dee Dee Dodds, was interviewed in 1958 and said that howling wind and the cooing of the pigeons makes the lighthouse an eerie place at night. In 1815, the York Gazette reported JP died a violent, bloody death. After the Americans burnt the Parliament buildings in York, trials were held inside the Grand Jordan's Hotel on King Street, west of Berkeley Street. The Irish-born soldiers John Blueman and John Henry pleaded not guilty. If they were found guilty, they would have been sentenced to death by hanging. The coroner in those days was Thomas Cooper, who was likely called to testify. There were no witnesses called for the defense. The soldiers were acquitted of the murder, but we don't know why, because very few records still exist. It would be a rather lonely job John Paul had on the edge of the world. Perhaps it was a blessing and curse when soldiers from the fort would visit. They would be company, and selling alcohol would give him extra money. But soldiers have a habit of needing to be violent and bold, and if angry and drunk is also added, this could be a recipe for risky behavior. How could JP defend himself against two angry Irish soldiers? These soldiers were from a regiment who raided and fought in the battles. All he could have done to survive is tried to run for his life. When the two soldiers named John dismembered his body, was there anyone to even hear his final cries? He might have heard the entire town of York cry when the Americans attacked and the explosion went off at the fort and the subsequent pillaging of the town. Did the soldiers arrive back at the fort with John Paul Radelmuller's blood on their clothes? John Paul Radelmuller kept the lighthouse to protect the ships entering the harbor, but there was no one to protect him. A lonely occupation in a lonely place, and his scattered remains left in a lonely grave on the edge of the world.